In the dimly lit basement of the Allegheny County Records Division, an archivist's gloved hand paused over a brittle envelope, its postmark faded to a ghostly blur. The tension in the room shifted as the typewritten letters on the page aligned perfectly with a decades-old threat, the imprint spacing identical, unmistakable, and chilling. If you like stories like this, make sure to subscribe and like the video. The case that would come to define Pittsburgh's quiet winter of 1980 began not with a dramatic chase nor a public outcry, but with an ordinary typewriter, a young woman's abrupt disappearance, and a stack of letters that police initially dismissed as attention-seeking mischief. The victim, 22-year-old administrative assistant and community college student, Elaine Hart, left her apartment on a mild October evening and never made it home. Pittsburgh in the early 1980s was split between steel decline and neighborhood endurance, its streets lined with row houses and fatting industrial proudness. Flyers bearing her face fluttered on telephone poles along Butler Street, Penn Avenue, and the bridges arcing over the Allegheny River. Her photograph was modest, unembellished, the kind of face that could blend into daily commuter crowds. What startled investigators early on was not only how quickly she vanished, but the arrival of typed letters received by her former employer, a small legal reporting office downtown, days before she disappeared. The letters were brief, devoid of emotion, typed neatly on cream paper that smelled faintly of chemical storage. The first warned of a grievance. The second hinted at retaliation. The third, arriving just 48 hours before Elaine's last confirmed sighting, carried a veiled threat that referenced office schedules and hallway locations known only to employees. Yet because there was no stated intent, no explicit declaration of harm, and because workplace disputes were common, the letters were filed, noted, and largely forgotten. Even when Elaine's missing person report reached the desk of the Pittsburgh Bureau of Police, the connection was not immediately emphasized. For days, the riverbanks, wooded edges of Shenley Park, and abandoned industrial lots were searched. Volunteers gathered near Highland Park's reservoir, combing foliage in neat rows. The late autumn air was dry, carrying the brittle smell of leaves and exhaust. Nothing surfaced. In the city's narrow streets, the case was mentioned only in quiet tones, the kind found on the back pages of local newsprint. As winter closed in, the investigation turned methodical. Detectives reviewed employment records, interviewed colleagues in sterile offices with fluorescent buzz, and examined Elaine's apartment. Nothing suggested forced exit or panic. Her belongings sat neatly as though she intended to return within the hour. Attention pivoted back to the typewritten letters. Detectives noted the precision of spacing, the slightly elevated imprint common to certain machines manufactured in the mid-1960s. Serial number logs for office typewriters were outdated, stored in filing cabinets that smelled of dust and brass. The police reports of the period described a procedural but strained effort, hindered by analog limitations. In January 1981, as temperatures dipped below freezing and sidewalks glazed with ice, a new lead surfaced. A maintenance worker at Elaine's office recalled an older employee, a part-time transcription contractor, who frequently complained about workload distribution. He had used his own typewriter rather than office equipment, citing preference and reliability. Still without physical linkage, the case lingered. Allegheny County detectives submitted paperwork, transcripts, and office correspondence into evidence boxes. Gas heaters hummed within precinct walls. Snowstorms hushed downtown traffic, muffling urgency. Elaine's family held modest vigils, their grief etched in hopeful restraint. Months folded into years. The steel industry continued to wane, businesses shifted, and the city's attention wandered. Elaine's case entered the backlog, stored among others in rows of beige archive shelving. In 1994, during a departmental audit prompted by evolving forensic practices, a junior analyst requested access to unsolved cases involving written threats. Elaine's file surfaced again. This time, handwriting and typing forensics had advanced, able to identify microabrasions on typeset hammers and ink transfer anomalies. The threat letters were re-examined under angled light and magnification. The elevated E was not an accident of machine age but a specific wear pattern. The analyst submitted comparisons across known equipment of the era. A database match was improbable given the incomplete acquisition of typewriter records across the country, yet the attempt signaled renewed focus. By 2001, digital records expanded capacity for storage and retrieval, enabling investigators to cross-reference personnel rosters and part-time contractor data that were once scattered across decades of paper. Elaine's former office had long since relocated, but its storage unit preserved ledgers of employment contracts. Among names listed, one reappeared with subtle consistency: a transcription specialist named Howard L. Rett, employed intermittently from 1977 to 1980. He had resigned abruptly 2 weeks before Elaine vanished. The old maintenance worker's note now resonated with sharper relevance. Rett's address history traced to a modest house on a quiet street in Wilkinsburg, a residential grid where porch lights illuminated cracked sidewalks and elm trees arched overhead. He had moved twice since Elaine's disappearance, and death records confirmed his passing in 1992. This complication, however, did not halt inquiry. Rather, it redirected investigators toward his estate records and any surviving possessions. In February 2002, with authorization from probate archives, detectives retrieved an itemized estate catalog. Among household effects, tools, and books, one listing carried weight: a 1966 Underwood typewriter described as well-used, mechanical, intact. The typewriter was stored in a county archive, untouched, sealed in careful packaging. Its keys bore the same elevated E configuration identified in threat letters. Under forensic analysis, spacing alignment, pressure pattern, and microwear on the R, T, and E keys matched with mathematical precision. The letters, once attributed to General Grievance, were now linked conclusively to Rett's machine. Investigators reconstructed the timeline with the clarity of hindsight. Rett had access to internal schedules, office locations, and work distribution details. His employment frustration was documented in terse memos found in storage boxes. Yet the evidentiary leap from typed threats to Elaine's disappearance still required grounding. In 2004, the district attorney's office authorized a final comparative review. Every surviving letter was measured against forensic standards adopted post-1990. Imprint depth showed uniformity uncommon among mass office equipment. The forensic examiner's report was concise, unemotional, and exact. The probability of another machine producing identical imprint sequences was statistically negligible. The era-specific manufacturing glitch of that Underwood model, resulting in irregular elevation of particular letters, only secured the match further. Still, the case lacked physical remains, witness confession, or definitive scene of disappearance. Pittsburgh's neighborhoods had changed, rails converted to trails, warehouses repurposed. Investigators turned to peripheral records, including public transport logs, parking lot receipts, and security memos preserved by private companies. One detail surfaced in 2006, a tow report from October 1980 documenting a vehicle registered to Rett found illegally parked near the very bus stop Elaine used on her last day. The location was blocks from his residence at the time. Though circumstantial, the renewed context sharpened investigative focus. Elaine's commute had intersected with Rett's movements. In January 2008, the district attorney issued a posthumous determination of culpability based on the typewriter match, evidentiary timeline, grievance motive, documented proximity, and absence of alternative suspects with similar access and fixation. The legal outcome was subdued, confined to case files, and a brief press note on the back pages of local print. The city, by then in a different era, with new industries and transformed neighborhoods, absorbed the conclusion quietly. Elaine's family received a formal summary in a courthouse office, whose windows faced the muted winter skyline, bridges arcing below like steel signatures of a city that had already moved on. In that calm administrative closure, the typewriter's weight became symbolic more than mechanical. The letters that once seemed trivial, devoid of direct threat, evolved into the decisive artifact. The forensic patience of decades secured answer, if not restoration. Pittsburgh's archives, dusted and reorganized, returned to silence, row upon row of solved and unsolved histories resting beneath fluorescent hum, their narratives sealed, labeled, and finally still. The official finding in 2008 did not ignite headlines nor stir public conversation beyond a short mention in the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette's community law docket. It existed instead in the space most cold cases occupy after resolution, quiet acknowledgement without spectacle. For Elaine's parents, by then elderly and living in a small retirement apartment outside of McKeesport, the determination arrived in a manila envelope with clean language, no speculation, and no allowance for sentiment. It confirmed what years of doubt, unanswered calls, and fading hope had already carved into them. The disappearance was no longer open. The typewritten threats were no longer ambiguous. The individual responsible had been identified with forensic certainty, even if the opportunity for testimony, defense, or confession had vanished with his death in 1992. The police summary that accompanied the district attorney's letter demonstrated a meticulous reconstruction of events. It cited employment rosters, office memos detailing distribution of transcription tasks, and a recorded dispute in late September 1980 in which Rett had submitted a written complaint regarding assignment equity. In his own typed grievance, found decades later in storage, the same elevated E appeared. That detail, once a mere curiosity in the era before digital analysis, had become a defining forensic signature. Investigators highlighted the alignment of tension between Rett and administrative scheduling, noting the precise language he used in complaints mirrored the impersonal tone of the 3 anonymous threat letters. Additional archival inquiries confirmed that Rett had rarely socialized with coworkers, declined office gatherings, and worked from personal equipment whenever possible. This distinction mattered because while many office typewriters were routinely serviced and replaced, his machine bore that unique imprint irregularity that ultimately anchored the case. The absence of overt conflict between Rett and Elaine, documented or otherwise, was addressed in final analysis. Rather than portraying visceral hostility, the case file depicted bureaucratic frustration escalating into fixation, a single employee's quiet resentment transforming into targeted intimidation, concealed beneath administrative formality. In the investigative summary, the police lieutenant in charge of the cold case review wrote a final line with reserved precision. The only reasonable evidentiary conclusion is that the same machine produced both the professional grievances and the threat letters preceding Elaine Hart's disappearance. That conclusion, paired with Rett's presence within walking distance of her transit route the week she vanished, closed the logic of the inquiry without dramatization. The report did not attempt to reconstruct what happened in detail beyond disappearance, because no further physical or testimonial evidence existed. Its restraint became its strength. In a field often pressured into conjecture, this file stood on verified linkage and careful forensic match alone. Following case closure, the typewriter itself was transferred from archive storage to an evidence security cabinet for permanent retention. Its keys, sealed beneath transparent forensic film, were no longer objects of ordinary writing but artifacts of legal truth. Technicians who handled it during analysis described the machine as immaculately preserved for its age, a fact consistent with Rett's reputation for maintaining personal equipment meticulously. The ribbon, though dried, carried enough ink residue patterns to assist imprint comparison. The spacebar resistance, measured through standardized keystroke compression, also matched faint pressure lines on the 3 anonymous letters. Each mechanical element served as a witness in absence of human testimony. The city around the closed case had shifted substantially since 1980. Waterfront districts once dominated by mills now contained parks, trail systems, and converted brick housing. University research centers expanded, and new medical institutions rose along Forbes Avenue. Yet in county storage rooms and courthouse subbasements, climate-controlled rooms still contain the tangible remnants of older investigations. Ledger books, traffic logs typed on onion skin paper, faded photographs clipped to cardboard. Elaine's case would remain among them, not in the unsolved section, but in the column reserved for matters closed by conclusive evidentiary determination. In 2010, 2 years after closure, a forensic journal published a brief technical note referencing the investigation. It did not name Elaine nor retell the narrative. Instead, it analyzed the significance of machine-specific typeface irregularity as probative evidence, citing the elevated E pattern as a teaching example for modern forensic coursework. Students in digital analysis programs at local institutions reviewed the case only through that lens, as demonstration of the value of archiving, preservation, and re-examination as technologies evolve. The emotional human dimension remained outside their study, a conscious separation between scientific method and personal tragedy. Elaine's family maintained no public statement. Their final interaction with officials took place in a courthouse meeting room with tinted windows overlooking Grant Street, where winter traffic rolled steadily below. The district attorney's liaison provided them with the closing summary and answered procedural questions without conjecture. No ceremony, commemoration, or dedication followed. It reflected the family's request for privacy, as well as the city's quiet procedural culture regarding cold case resolutions, without surviving suspects. The estate record of Howard Rett, once an administrative footnote, became historically relevant in legal archives. Boxes that contained his personal documents, work logs, and mechanical manuals remained sealed but cataloged, indexed not for narrative interest but for evidentiary integrity. For archivists, the case reaffirmed the principle that no document, however mundane or obsolete, should be discarded without review, as future application may shift its value entirely. The typewriter, so ordinary in its time, had carried a unique identifier that became pivotal decades later. In 2013, when Allegheny County modernized its cold case unit with expanded digital indexing, Elaine's file transitioned from cardboard to encrypted format. The scanned pages retained their analog texturing, faint coffee stains on investigative logs, corner smudges on photocopies, the slightly uneven ink of carbon paper reproductions, but now existed in searchable form. That digitization allowed training units to reference the forensic methodology without disturbing original documents. It also preserved the file against deterioration, ensuring its longevity beyond paper's natural vulnerability to humidity and dust. The community memory of the disappearance diminished with passing years. The block where Elaine lived had undergone renovation, apartments repainted, tenants rotated, and businesses beneath them replaced. Neighbors from 1980 largely no longer resided there. The few who recalled the missing person flyers described only a general atmosphere of unease that autumn, a quiet uncertainty rather than panic. A librarian who had distributed flyer copies at the time spoke briefly to a campus historian in 2016, stating simply that the case faded rather than concluded. That phrasing captured the emotional arc even after official closure, an absence resolved by fact, yet never animated by narrative revelation or spoken admission. Cold cases solved through indirect forensic signature rather than confession create a particular kind of ending, complete in structure, silent in tone. No courtroom argument unfolded, no cross-examination, and no witness box testimony. The legal conclusion resided entirely in document alignment, imprint measurement, and statistical certainty. In that regard, the Pittsburgh case of 1980 demonstrated the endurance of material culture, machines, paper, ink, as bearers of truth long after human actors depart. When the final internal review of the case was conducted in 2018 as part of general archival assessment, officials found no grounds for reopening or further pursuit. Every potential evidentiary avenue had been exhausted. Rett's death prevented any legal motion beyond posthumous determination. The absence of physical remains prevented a full reconstruction, but the disappearance itself, categorized legally as homicide by unknown mechanism with identified responsible party, required no additional classification. A single sentence in the review summary stated, "The conclusion remains valid and stands uncontested." Pittsburgh continued its gradual transformation, neighborhoods shifting identities through renewal and preservation. Bridges bore traffic and winter salt, river fog still rose against steel trusses at dawn, and courthouse floors continued to echo with the subdued footsteps of clerks carrying files from basement archive to judges' chambers. Among those thousands of documents, Elaine Hart's file would remain a closed chapter, its resolution neither celebrated nor forgotten, but held in the equilibrium of factual justice, solved, silent, and permanently recorded. In the years following the official closure, the case of Elaine Hart entered a space that many resolved cold cases occupy when no trial, no courtroom presence, and no living perpetrator remained to frame its ending. It sat in the municipal landscape as an event that was no longer active but never fully absorbed into local memory. Pittsburgh's judicial framework continued forward, as did its infrastructural development, cycling through district expansions, technological modernization, and rotating administrative staff who inherited older histories without emotional attachment. The file itself, now digitized, required authentication transfers every few years as county software updated. Each transition ensured that the forensic match between the Underwood typewriter and the letters preceding Elaine's disappearance remained preserved in official record, rather than locked solely in a physical cabinet bound to paper decay. Investigators who had participated in the final analysis retired gradually, their contributions noted in internal commendations that did not leave the department's walls. In the absence of trial publicity and testimony, the case remained a matter of procedural success rather than public narrative. The statistical note inserted into the National Index of Resolved Cold Cases described the resolution in neutral phrasing, identifying the evidentiary method, mechanical imprint analysis, and the closure designation, conclusive assignment of responsibility to deceased party. It did not mention the river searches, the early winter vigils, or the quietness with which the city absorbed the outcome. It existed instead as data shaped to instruct future forensic auditors and archivists on the value of preserving equipment-based trace signatures beyond their active technological period. By 2020, the Forensic Sciences Division at the county level had shifted almost entirely to digital methodologies. Encryption protocols protected archived files, chain-of-custody logs were automated, and evidence indexing allowed for forensic comparison that would have been inconceivable during Elaine's disappearance. Yet the physical typewriter, the central artifact, remained sealed in its evidence container. Its status as mechanical proof transcended advances in scanning technology and algorithmic analysis. The cold metal keys, worn in distinct pattern, existed as a fixed imprint of time, impervious to reinterpretation or error revision. Unlike digital forensics, which can be recalibrated and updated, the typewriter preserved its certainty through immutability. It existed not as symbol, but as object of measurable, repeatable forensic truth. In the academic radius beyond law enforcement, the case surfaced occasionally in controlled research contexts. Graduate seminars in information preservation referenced the importance of chain-of-custody documentation, noting that the typewriter was cataloged correctly despite early archival environments lacking climate regulation. Had humidity or rust compromised the keys, comparative imprint certainty might have been reduced, altering the strength of resolution decades later. Thus, the case provided a model of how non-digital artifacts, when maintained without disturbance, may outlast changing investigative eras while retaining evidentiary authority. Though students rarely discuss the human dimension, the forensic lesson endured in structured analysis of method and material. Elaine's community college records, still stored in institutional archives, were occasionally referenced for enrollment statistics, course restructuring history, and long-term analysis of student demographic trends. Her name appeared in those logs without annotation or memorial addition. It remained one of many enrolled in the autumn of 1980, unchanged regardless of what followed. The neutrality with which institutions maintain records reflects a systemic approach to history that excludes emotional inflection. This neutrality, while stark, allowed Elaine to remain part of institutional lineage without transformation into symbol or cautionary emblem. She existed in the college ledger as simply present, enrolled, and afterward no longer registered, with only police documents acknowledging the continuity of her absence. The neighborhood where she lived underwent further transformation, as historic row houses repurposed into mixed-use residences. A cafe occupied the corner where the original flyer had once hung. The bridge where community volunteers gathered to distribute searches now bore recreational signage promoting walking trails. No plaque or marker referenced the disappearance. The absence of public memorialization was not erasure by intention, but the gradual turnover inherent to urban life. New residents inherited streets without inheriting their histories, and the case receded from lived memory into the silent endurance of typed reports stored beyond public view. Within law enforcement training modules, the Pittsburgh case became an example in the subsection of evidentiary patience. It was used to demonstrate how routine administrative documents, memos, letters, grievances, can evolve into forensic anchors long after their origin. The 3 anonymous threat letters were no longer examined for their content, but for their mechanical precision. line spacing, ink density, repeated wear impressions. Their transformation from warning to key forensic linkage illustrated how investigative significance may unfold outside temporal expectation. New detectives studied the case with disciplined detachment, instructed in the necessity of retaining every document regardless of immediate investigative valuation. They were taught that absence of narrative clarity did not diminish evidentiary completeness. The district attorney's written conclusion remained unchanged across review cycles. When verification audits occurred in 2022 and 2024, they confirmed the solidity of forensic findings and affirmed that no contradictory evidence had surfaced. Advances in genetic testing, normally associated with resolved cold cases, were not applicable here. No DNA, no biological residue, and no physical contact evidence belonged to the investigative inheritance. The typewriter alone remained the evidentiary mechanism through which accountability had been secured. Thus, the case maintained its unique procedural identity, a disappearance resolved through non-biological forensic discipline, resting entirely on the mechanical signature of typed characters. As the city continued to develop economically and academically, with its riverfronts integrated into cultural districts and public spaces, the internal geography of memory altered without intention. Archives, however, do not adapt in the same way. They retain the paper grain, the original staples, the carbon copy ink patterns that define their origin moment. Elaine's investigative chronology existed within that immovable format. Time-altered context, not the record. The disappearance, last sighting points, and threat letters remained documented exactly as first written. The static preservation of institutional language, resisting reinterpretation or emotional revision. In this final period of archival permanence, the case reached a point where no further administrative action, forensic enhancement, or digital review could alter its outcome. The typewriter remained the final word, its evidentiary clarity neither amplified nor diminished by decades of procedural advancement. The responsible party, deceased long before procedural conclusion, remained identified without posthumous narrative expansion. No motive exploration extended beyond documented workplace frustration. The absence of sensational detail preserved the integrity of resolution. It remained, ultimately, a case defined by restraint. In that quiet equilibrium, Elaine Hart's disappearance reached its conclusion not through revelation or public reckoning, but through the steady preservation of material truth. The investigative path, though fragmented across decades, aligned in its ending. Pittsburgh's files held her record, its mechanical linkage, and its final determination with unembellished precision. Her story, resolved without ceremony, remained secured in the controlled stillness of courthouse archives, where fluorescent lights continue their uninterrupted hum above shelves of boxed history. And the past persists not through memory but through method, documented permanently and without need for further voice.